I'm also working on a project to kind of deal with these issues to
Oh,
make it well, kind of a more decentralized social media approach, a better way where you kind of have more ownership of your own product, if
oh,
you
good,
will.
yeah. Well, it's, my God, it has just become so contentious, this town square idea, like I
Mhm.
read a really interesting article, I'd say it must be 5 or 6 years ago, about shame and the importance of shame in regulating society. And that, like maybe it was okay in the colonial era where they would literally shame a housewife, for being adulterous or whatever.
Mhm.
But it was a very interesting take. And they said, social media has kind of brought that back in, that you can be doxxed or publicly humiliated, but now it's gone so far to the other extreme. So
Yeah,
yeah, it's an interesting take. But anyway, I will start this, I guess. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the Irish American Heritage Museum on a snowy night. I'm just looking out my window and we're getting the first few. It looks a bit wet as opposed to, beautiful white snow, but it is snowing. And I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Martin Nutty, who is the co-host of one of the most influential podcasts on Irish and Irish American issues. It's called Irish Stew, and they do a lot of different interviews with people. They'll talk about different historical topics. It's a varied kind of show, so it's not just history for those of you who are interested. It's current affairs and things too. Martin was born in Dublin in the 1960s and spent his childhood in Kinsealy, a small, at the time, rural community. It's really close to Dublin City now, and of course famous for a link with a past Taoiseach. While he was in high school in Ireland, he became involved in track and field athletics, and he specialized in the shot put and discus, and was fortunate to have been kind of mentored by an Irish Olympian, Philip Conway. So he decided to actually follow in Philip's footsteps and pursue an athletic scholarship in America. So he attended St. John's University, New York City, and did get involved in sport here at a collegiate level, and won a national cap team for the Irish team in 1985. But training, of course, and the physical effects of that put an end to his athletic aspirations. And he has been in New York since you came to college, Martin. Am I right?
that's correct. Yes, thank
Yeah.
you, Elizabeth.
So welcome. Thank you very much. So let's talk a little bit about that. This idea, a boy growing up just outside Dublin City. Did your family, did you have, Irish American cousins, or was it just your athleticism that brought you to America?
It was just my athleticism and a fantasy about the possibility of achieving Olympic greatness that drove me. It does actually turn out that I do actually have a variety of Irish American cousins that were unbeknownst to me.
Hmm.
As you know, people that know me, they'll also know that I'm a bit of a genealogical nerd and spend way too much time and too much money on ancestry.com. I'm one of those numbskulls that decided to push my DNA through that and consequently identified a lot of other distant relations based in Chicago. A one gentleman who actually didn't know who his actual father was. It's one of those, things when you go get your ancestry tested and you find out your brother does not share the same father with you, but I was the most closely related one to him. And it took us about 5 years to figure out, but we could figure out how he was related to me. So yes, it turns out decades later, as I got more interested in my family history, that I found out I had a slew of American relations.
Wow, yeah. Do you think that happened, Martin, because you became an immigrant? I think, because this kind of actually happened to us too. I think Irish people at home are maybe a little bit complacent. We know we came from this place. My aunt and uncle are here. My grandparents are here. And you forget, that your grandparents had siblings that left, or first cousins that left. And that connection is very important for the American side. But sometimes the Irish side are kind of, the immediate family are here. We don't need to worry. But I think when you become an immigrant yourself, you like to fill in the gaps, and understand the story of other people that left, maybe.
Yeah, I've always actually been a history nerd.
Mm.
And my mother, who just passed away recently at 93, inculcated in me an actual interest in my family history. Now, she was born in England,
Oh,
She had three English grandparents and one Irish one. My
wow.
father was born in Dublin
Mm.
with three Irish grandparents and one English one. So
Oh,
technically speaking, I'm meant to be 50-50, but if you believe ancestry DNA, I'm about 60% Irish. That's questionable, these, these ethnicity tests that are run by Ancestry are somewhat questionable. But I think because of my mother's complicated background, she moved to Ireland when she was 7 years old, that she was maybe more attentive to kind of family relationships and history, etc. And so I grew up with that. And so I was actually researching my family tree when I was 16 years old, so long before I came to America. It was only after I came to America, as kind of technology improved and genealogy kind of went online, that I was able to probe into all sorts of, deeper databases of information and explore that extended history in an interesting way. And I think exploring your family tree and using that as a lens to understand the underlying history is a really interesting way to understand kind of the broader social history that is in everybody's background.
yeah.
So history is generally, there's the kind of the great man theory of history, which is, about all the rich, the wealthy, the powerful. But actually, in many respects, some of the most important history is the history of average and normal people and how they made a living.
Yeah.
But to double back to your kind of question about, do immigrants generally become more interested in their family history, I would say yes. It wasn't a motivation for me, but I've been exploring over the last 5 years or so as I got more deeply involved in the Irish American community, about why 30 to 40 million Americans will now sign on as being of Irish extraction. That's 10% of the population in the United States. That is a huge number. Just in terms of comparison with the island of Ireland, we're only dealing with 6 million people in total for the whole island of Ireland. So we're talking about 5 times the number of people are definitively saying that they're Irish, meaning that they have some Irish blood. There may very well be more. Indeed, some of those 30 to 40 odd million actually might have it wrong altogether. Maybe they don't have a drop of Irish blood at all. That's also a possibility, but usually they're pretty much on the mark. But it kind of begs the question, and a lot of times Irish people, at least in my experience, and I travel myself, I'm pretty much there at least once or twice a year, are always perplexed about
you're frozen.
the shore and looking for their roots, because that is something
that Martin, you're frozen. I don't know if it's we'll give it a second. He might come back. It isn't me, I can say. Are you there, Martin? We just lost you for a tick. Yeah. You might have to exit and come back in, but I won't. Yeah. Okay. I'm hoping he'll come back in. Just let me email him to let him know. Oh, are you back? You're back. Excellent.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we don't have your camera yet.
Okay, that's fine.
It's coming. We got you. Okay, great. So you're just tuned out when you were saying
sorry about that.
No problem. I know technology, it might be the snow. You were saying that Irish Americans kind of claim it, and that they're very eager to claim their connection. And then we didn't hear the rest of what you were saying. Don't tell me you're gone again. Oh no, you're back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's certainly something that I've been exploring. That's certainly an area that I've been exploring, and I think this kind of notion of what I call rootedness is really important to people.
Yeah.
Because I think fundamentally all people thrive on the strength of the connections that they have around them, whether that is their family, whether that is the work they do, whether that is maybe a faith community that they belong in. All of these things are really important. And so deep down for many of us, I'm not saying all of us, it's important to kind of know the backstory. Where do I come from? Why am I the way that I am? You know, the big question of, is it nature or is it nurture? And so a lot of times we go exploring these questions. And I think the need to belong to a place and have a narrative around you kind of grounds people. And so that's why I think a lot of Irish Americans, this is an important thing in their life, and it's the motivation for why they visit in Ireland. I think Irish people who lived in Ireland all their lives, and maybe understand at least 3 or 4 generations back, where their grandparents came from, where their great grandparents came from, they feel they belong somewhere. For immigrant communities, many of them have dealt with some kind of trauma from migration. Nobody leaves their home place to go live in another country. Well, let me rephrase that. Most people that leave their home country and go to set up shop in another country don't do so because things are great back at home. They're uprooted many times because of economic reasons, because there's better opportunity elsewhere. And that severing of those connections, I believe, can be very traumatic. And so what you're seeing is people, reestablishing those connections again. And it gives them a better sense of belonging. And indeed, even though they may themselves not be an immigrant like I am, their grandparents were immigrants, and some of that cross-generational trauma can be passed down in very odd ways. You kind of wonder, why was granddad or grandma like that? Okay. So I think when you begin to understand those questions a little bit more about just how difficult it was for many of these people, and understand their background question, why they left, I think then, you can come to a deeper understanding of the Irish experience and your own familial experience.
Yeah. And I think, Martin, when you think about Irish American writers, even Alice McDermott and Charming Billy, but of course our songs and there's so much in our culture, I think, that kind of does hold on to that sorrow about leaving, whether it's, the Great Hunger 175 years ago or, just economic depression from the 1950s. The Irish on both sides of the Atlantic tend to keep that sort of wound raw, in a way, I think, more than other cultures do, or more even than, the Irish in Australia don't seem to be as, even though they were a penal colony, like there seems to be a sense of kind of getting on with it more in Australia, I think. Maybe it's because it's further away. But, have you thought about that, that kind of, and we talked a little bit about it before we came on live, that sometimes the Irish at home don't understand that connection that Americans have with Ireland, and so there's this sense of, well, you're not Irish, you're a plastic paddy, or so there's a misunderstanding at home in Ireland of how important the diaspora feel that connection is,
So, one of the pieces of advice I give to any American, Irish American, or any American going forward, especially Irish Americans, is when you show up in Ireland, don't say you're Irish. It's quite acceptable to say you're Irish American. And where things can cause confusion and breakdown between these two, I believe they are two very distinctive cultures. Is in America, when you say you're Irish, what you're really doing is shorthand, because it's understood, especially if you've got an American accent, is that you're Irish American. So you simply say you're Irish. And so there's a context shift that sometimes doesn't take place when you're a tourist. So you say, I'm Irish, and they say, no, you're not, because you didn't grow up here. But I also think there's a misunderstanding from the Irish community about Irish America itself. I don't think they fully understand the nature of that, and how it is a different culture. So Irish people of Ireland rightfully are very proud of, let's say, their literary traditions. So they will talk about Yeats, and they will talk about Shaw, and they will talk about Wilde, and they will talk about Beckett and Seamus Heaney, etc. Okay, but there's an equally powerful literary tradition that's grown up in Irish America. So, if you think about F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Steinbeck is somebody that I looked at recently. Now, I really do like Steinbeck is Irish, but indeed, Steinbeck, central to Steinbeck's, a lot of his literature is actually stories that are based strongly on his Irish grandfather. And so you can start kind of peeling away at things, and what I think is poorly understood in Ireland is the actual richness of Irish American culture. What a lot of times they think, I guess the people of Ireland, when they look at Irish Americans, kind of consider them to be very bound by their continental experience. In other words, the Irish of Ireland are very outward looking because it's such a tiny, teeny, tiny little country. We tend to know a lot about other things that are going outside the country. Americans, multi-generational Americans that are growing up in America may have less of a broad experience because this is, an extraordinary country. It's huge. It's got a massive population. And so we know a lot about what's going on inside America, but maybe a lot less so about what's going on outside the borders. And so these are some of these things that are kind of feeding into the hopper. But if you ask an Irish person, tell me about, what you know about Missouri, they're going to know pretty much nothing. So it should be no surprise, or it shouldn't be a surprise for an Irish person, that Americans maybe do not know a lot of in-depth history about Ireland or many other of the smaller European countries. So one of the things that I'm kind of trying to address in the podcast, this Irish Stew podcast that I do, is kind of having some of those conversations to kind of firm things up. Ireland wouldn't have become an independent country without the support of Irish Americans. So a lot of the funding of the Irish Revolution, I'm talking about the 1916 Rising, we're just coming off this century or this decade of centenaries where we kind of celebrate all these like major things that were happening 100 years ago. Anybody that knows anything about modern Irish history kind of knows that the bulk of the financing that made the country independent was raised in America. I think a lot of Irish people feel quite uncomfortable about that notion.
It's amazing, how actually that is not really talked about. Certainly we didn't learn that at school, that Casement left for Germany from New York, that bit was conveniently left out, and just how powerful the Irish American press with people like John Devoy was in forwarding, that cause. Before we go back into talking about the past, and I do want to do that with you, you raised an interesting point there too about like how Irish America is a sort of a separate culture from maybe other Americans, but also from Irish. Have you noticed, Martin, in the last number of years, and I'm not sure quite how to phrase this, but, as Ireland has ratified, for instance, same-sex marriage and repealed the Eighth Amendment and all of that, there's a kind of a growing divide, I think, because some of Irish America is actually quite conservative and much more traditionally Catholic, for instance, in ways that, mass attendance in Ireland is, I'd say, at maybe 30%, of what it was in the heyday, like of the 20th century. So there's kind of a growing divide, I think, between Irish America and Ireland in one way, socially. How are you, what do you think of that?
Well, I think, Irish America is a big tent. And so there are people of all political stripes within that tent. What I tell people when I talk about Ireland is it's probably the most liberal, and I mean socially liberal in this case, not economic liberality. It's the most socially liberal country probably in the Western world. It is the only country, for example, that has had a referendum on gay marriage, and where that referendum passed, quite dramatically. I believe in favor was 60% plus. So it's
Yeah.
And the country itself has changed so dramatically.
Yeah.
Like in 40 years, when I left Ireland in 1983, 40 years ago, it was an economic basket case. It was closer to developing nation status than it was to a, economic, part of the, Western world economic bloc. And obviously, things have changed enormously. Now, I believe there's something like 56 or 57% of the population in Ireland holds a college degree. It's quite a bit higher than in the United States. Does that mean that it necessarily be more liberal? Well, if you look at, the political split in America, you can kind of see that, people that are college graduates tend to go vote a bit more Biden. People that are maybe more blue collar and are not college graduates tend to vote a bit more Trump. Now, there's of course exceptions to that, but I think what you're seeing is this, shift. The other thing I would say about it is a lot of times because of communications, when Irish people immigrated, certainly at the start of my experience, when you moved to America, you were pretty much disconnected from Ireland. And consequently, people would be here for 10 or 20 years and wouldn't travel back. And so what would happen was they would take a snapshot of their experience 20 years ago and assume that the country had not changed in the interim.
Yeah.
Now, 50 or 60 years ago, that might have been the case.
Yeah.
Now, every time I go to Ireland now, and I spend a lot of time, certainly around Dublin, it's astonishing because the country that I left was, very homogenous. Now it's something like, I don't know, 16% of the population in Ireland. I'm not sure the exact figures. You'd have to look at the CSO, are foreign born.
Yeah, I think it's actually 20%. It's quite high. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's actually, I believe now higher in the United States, which is pretty amazing because the one thing that Ireland was known for was the export of humans.
Yeah.
Now it has become an importer of humans because of its economic success. So all of these things, I think, are kind of going into the hopper. Now, what I would say is we live in a different era now, where we have global tech. And so now people are able to be much more easily both Irish and American. And if they take the trouble maybe to travel there and spend some time there, they can establish all sorts of interesting connections there and maintain those connections quite cheaply. In other words, it's not predicated necessarily in traveling anymore. So there are lots of different opportunities to engage with the country that just weren't available. Certainly weren't available 40 years ago when I came here. The shock of disconnection when I arrived here was pretty extreme.
Yeah. Oh, I even in the 90s, I remember I came as a college student and, it was expensive to ring home, like using the phone, and not every phone was set up for international calling even, it was a bit crazy. So to go back, and I think we should deal with like the American support for Irish independence and all that in a minute, but what are your sort of highs and lows of Irish American history? I liked, when you were saying a minute ago that we can look at history as, the story of great men kind of thing. So obviously the Irish contribution in the Civil War is important, but I think so too are the building of schools and hospitals, by nuns because of the, how anti-Catholic things were in the 19th century. So it doesn't have to be like a very famous example, but what are the highs of Irish American history and then the lows?
Well, I think, a lot of times we make the mistake and we become very focused on the family. And I think we also might make a mistake by being very focused on the Catholic aspect of this. Let's be clear. The first major wave of immigration that came from Ireland was primarily Presbyterians from Northern Ireland that were on the lam after engaging in the 1798 revolution and got the hell out of Dodge because that particular effort to overthrow British rule failed abysmally. And many of those folks showed up and they settled down states like Virginia and were enormously influential in the early part of the Republic in America. So I think if anybody has watched that show about Aaron Burr and Jefferson, the one on Broadway, I'm blanking on the name of it right
Hamilton.
now. Hamilton, yes, thank you.
Now, see how come Burr comes to your mind first?
Yeah. Well, because he was so scurrilous, we all. But I don't think he was Irish, fortunately.
No.
But who knows for sure? But
Hercules Mulligan was off the boat. Yeah,
exactly. Hercules Mulligan was a guy, that was off the boat, and he was a tailor, and he was one of George Washington's most influential spies in Ireland. And in many respects, Washington may not have actually survived his escape from New York City without the intervention of Hercules Mulligan. So I think Irish people can rightly lay claim to having, had multiple impacts on, the very earliest stages of American independence. Now, so I could point to many other high points, but I could also point to the low point. I had the pleasure is the wrong word. I had the opportunity about a month ago to go down to Andersonville in Georgia.
Oh, yeah. Damien Shields and the gang there have put up.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So we've had Damien Shields on the podcast a couple of times, and Damien invited me to go down to Andersonville, where a plaque was unveiled to the Irish that had perished in Andersonville. And for those that are not familiar with Andersonville, it was this horrendous POW camp during the Civil War. The site now is both, and it's well worth a visit, it continues to be this massive cemetery, but it also contains the museum for POW history. And it's also an extraordinarily important Civil War site. So somewhere between 30 and 40,000 prisoners marched through the gates of Andersonville. 10,000 of them didn't make it out again. Now, we know at this point that some 1,000 Irish perished in Andersonville. And Damien Shields, who is this historian who has done extraordinary work on documenting the contributions of the Irish-born and the ethnically Irish that participated in the American Civil War, has done extraordinary work in telling the stories of these people. But the one thing that struck me, and what I said to Damien at the time, is that the hard thing to grasp is that some of the people that had died in Andersonville were also old enough to have seen people dying on the streets in Ireland during the famine. And what happened to them? They had fled the famine. They had gone to America. They had, for a variety of reasons, decided to sign up for the Union Army. And they had fetched up in this remote prison in Georgia under horrendous conditions and saw people dying around them of exactly the same diseases.
Yeah.
That malnutrition, of typhoid and dysentery, etc. Exactly the same things that had killed family members, and they themselves, maybe for some of them, it would have been the last thing that they thought before they perished. So if you want to ask me about what was a low experience in that, I can't imagine anything that's more low. And it's sadly something that is very much poorly understood in both Ireland and probably in America as well.
Martin, I don't know if you can hear me or not, but oh yeah, you're back. Good.
So I'm not sure if you caught the rest of it. So
no, but Damien is amazing. We've had him a couple of times before he was even doing the Andersonville project. He, his work on just the pension files in the Irish American Civil War was amazing. And so then, what do you make of the likes of Tammany Hall and machine politics? Of course, it wasn't just New York, Boston, and Chicago had their politics too. Did you? Some people say, politics kind of came naturally to the Irish. Of course, we were a politicized nation because of, the likes of Daniel O'Connell with the monster meetings and stuff. So even though, we were a colony, some Irish people were voting quite quickly. And I think Irish people understood how important it was, to have access to the vote. I love Terry Galway's book, Machine Made, because there's this argument to be made, and I think kind of rightfully, that Tammany, yes, it's a little bit corrupt, and all that, but was it really any more corrupt than, men meeting in the league club and arranging things over dinner, of oysters and stuff? And the fact that there is no social welfare, or there is no kind of safety net. And so, Tammany Hall are very astute politicians, and as their districts change, they're not just representing Irish, they are representing the new coming Italians and Chinese and whoever else is living, in these areas. So do you want to talk a little bit about Tammany Hall and how you see that? And is it uniquely Irish American?
So I would say, first of all, when we look at the Irish experience in America is in some respects quite bizarre, because you have a primarily agrarian people. Most of the immigrants in Ireland during the famine era and the decades thereafter were primarily from the west coast of Ireland, a rural people. There was many of them that showed up in America without actually being able to speak English. So the folks down in Luxman House have done some research on that particular space. And indeed, you can look at censuses from 1850 and 1860, and you will see when they put in what language they speak, you'll see Irish or Gaelic. So they didn't actually speak English. And I don't think you can really understand Tammany or what happened without understanding the degree of bigotry that existed in America that was directed at poor Catholic immigrants. Now, I can put on my other hat and say, okay, if I was a New Yorker, a Yankee New Yorker, and all of a sudden droves of Irish people started showing up, impoverished, disease-ridden, let's say I wouldn't be too thrilled about that experience. Then add the layer of, this perception of Catholicism as some kind of stealth way to undermine, American democracy. You can see how all these tensions kind of bled together. Now, the Irish, of course, are people that have been denied the opportunity to express themselves politically within their home country. And so they're, once given the opportunity to vote, they grabbed it with both hands and were very effective at basically taking control of the apparatus, especially in New York City. I'm reminded that in 1851, apparently 1 in 4 people in New York were actually foreign born from Ireland specifically. So their outside influence, the speed at which they gained influence is extraordinary.
It is,
and caused all sorts of kind of integration tensions, if you will, that played out for decades. And I believe they continue to play out for close to 100 years. That we only truly ever got over our American anti-Catholic bigotry with the election of JFK. And I think you can find in certain corners of America anti-Catholic bigots to this day. There's always bigots to be found. I would hope that they are pretty thin on the ground at this point. But they're certainly there. But 50 or 60 years ago, that was, as you remember, JFK's campaign. There was a lot of talk about who was JFK answerable to. Was he answerable to the Constitution or to the Pope? It's somewhat ridiculous now if you think about it. When Joe Biden was running for election 3 years ago or 4 years ago, nobody was asking him those kind of questions. And we all know that Joe Biden certainly makes a point of expressing his Catholic faith. It's important to him. So it just tell you how big a road we have traveled.
Yeah, and I was going to say it was nearly the reverse in Biden's campaign, because I think there was some Catholic groups that were pushing back against him because he was pro-choice.
Very much so.
Even though, you were practicing your religion privately, you would assume, the Kennedy, and tomorrow being the anniversary, let's talk about him for a second. I am always fascinated, when Al Smith ran for president in 27, 28, and I remember as if I was there, but there was an article in the paper asking the exact same question, like, that what is Smith going to do when the Pope issues an encyclical? And allegedly his response was, what the hell is an encyclical? And I believe it was a friend of his who was involved in his campaign, but he was Jewish, I think his name was Prausker, and he wrote the rebuttal to this very famous, kind of Anglican lawyer that had posed this question. And that was in 1927. And, he said, I hope we'll never again have to have this discussion, like I'm an American first, I'm a New Yorker second, I'm a Catholic way down the line kind of a thing. And nobody should have to defend his religion when he's going to run, for public office. And yet, as you say, Kennedy, absolutely in 1960 had to defend this again and again.
Yes.
So
I think, with any immigrant group, especially if they're very diverse and very different from the existing base, always has to deal with these issues.
Yeah.
And we are, 175 years after the first big wave of, famine immigration, more than 175 years now. And we're still having a very problematic discussion about immigration within this country.
Yeah.
We just haven't come to terms with it. We cannot talk across the political divide on this issue.
Yeah.
Because the old legacies that haunt us from history are still present with us.
Yeah.
I'm reminded, a lot of times I've seen lately in just a general dialogue in politics, a talk about white culture. And so sometimes, I remind people that when you go to Europe, there is no talk about white culture.
Yeah.
There is only a talk about Irish culture or English culture or French culture.
Yeah.
The whole white thing, sadly, is a construction and a legacy of racism. And let's be clear here, the relationship between the Irish and African American communities, suffered an enormous body blow because of the race riots during, the Civil War, the draft riots. And, there's some thought that, it really kind of damaged that relationship between these two very downtrodden communities. And it never really recovered from that. And there was a tension there because, let's be honest, when the famine Irish showed up, they were the poorest of the poor. Well, who was in worse shape? Well, you can make a case that Black Africans were probably even worse shape, right? So
recently freed from slavery, like it only ended in 1827 in New York.
So that legacy of, they in some respects they made common cause, in other respects, the draft riots kind of dug a canyon that has persisted to this day. It's interesting because I cross paths, with a lot of African folk of Irish extraction. Let's say it's deeply, it calls for very delicate discussions because you kind of wonder, okay, well, exactly, where does your Irish roots come from, and what were the circumstances behind those? And they are, invariably unpleasant. What is interesting, of course, in Ireland, again, going back to the multicultural thing of modern day Ireland, is, we have quite a large community in Ireland from Nigeria or of Nigerian extraction. And you see these folks, they can be first generation now, making themselves known, especially in mild sport, track and field. So one of the best runners in the world right now is a young Irish woman who grew up in South Dublin called Rashida Adeleke. She may very well win an Olympic medal next year. And she is as Irish could be, except she's this very tall, elegant young lady who's about 6 foot tall, a very striking, woman of African extraction. But she would very much see herself as Irish. And I think, that might play differently over this side of the world,
Yeah, we've done talks with both, the Black and Irish group at home and here the African American Irish Diaspora Network. And, as you say, like 36% of African Americans have Irish ancestry. And I will say there was an essay in, I think it was Bear and Mars' book on New York years ago about desirable companions and agreeable friends or lovers, whatever. And there was, as you said, a certain amount of intermarriage and, living together, working together. before the draft riots, and
I think Larry Kerwin tried to
Larry
capture that
Kerwin's,
well with his show on Broadway,
it was
Paradise
fantastic,
Alley,
wasn't it?
trying to speak to that. Unfortunately, his timing was bad, and to this point in time, Broadway has still not recovered from COVID.
From COVID, which
So,
the lady
and it's
won
very, very difficult
to mount a musical.
Yes.
But the woman won a Tony, I think. Like we took a group down from the museum. It was amazing. Did you see it, Martin, the musical?
Yeah,
I thought it was amazing. I hope they can somehow revive it. It was fantastic. So let's talk then a little bit, as you say, about American support for Irish independence and politics right the way through. Like, it is amazing how little we learned about that in Ireland, certainly not in high school anyway, about not only support for kind of 1803 and later on, but certainly the 1916 Rising was practically planned. A lot of the signatories of the proclamation at home had been in America, either working or just fundraising. Even Padraig Pearse, came to America, I think, to fundraise. And then, of course, right the way through to the Good Friday Agreement, they were nearly instrumental, really, in creating that space that brought, the likes of Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley together to the table with, Tony Blair, or David Cameron. What was his name? Yeah, and Trimble. I was trying to think of Trimble. So tell me, let's discuss that a little bit. Clinton, they've never really ratified that he has Irish ancestry in Roscommon or not. So this is not necessarily, like a Ted Kennedy-esque figure. Like it's not always Irish American politicians who are driving this. But it seems to be, maybe the Irish Americans are such an important voting bloc that it transcends ethnicity for a while,
Well, I think in the case of Clinton, it was an opportunity to solve a problem.
Yeah.
We obviously have, this significant outbreak of violence again, sadly, in the Middle East. To some degree, the problems in Northern Ireland are similar problems, written smaller, smaller community, maybe, less of an entrenched divide, but still a significant divide. So for Clinton, I think being involved in the Good Friday Accords was an opportunity to potentially solve a problem. Now, I would also add, I've had the pleasure of hosting a number of members of the Irish Diplomatic Forum podcast. And what I've learned from that is really a different appreciation for the notion of soft power, which is, I think, in the Irish diplomatic community should rightly be very proud of their ability to leverage that soft power, because basically the Irish diplomatic community cultivated important American political figures to exert pressure on Margaret Thatcher to bring her to the table, to begin the discussions that ultimately led to the Good Friday Accord and to a settlement. And it's an extraordinary achievement. There's much work to be done to kind of, get Northern Ireland in a much more stable political environment. There are still great difficulties there, but people aren't blowing each other up anymore. They're not shooting each other up. So violence there is much more sporadic, but there's plenty of work to be done there. But looking at it from the broader spectrum, going back into the 19th century, we could talk about the Fenians in New York, and the creation of the first submarine in New York was part of an Irish plot to attack the British Navy. So John Holland, who is the actual inventor of the submarine, originates out of Ireland, and he works in association with a number of members of Clan, I think it's Clan McGale, to kind of finance the creation of submarines.
And it looks like it would barely sink, not to mind, actually float.
So you have this extraordinary history, decade after decade, of involvement in the Irish community, and that community being refreshed by the continuous political repression that many Irish people felt, certainly in the first half of the 19th century in Ireland, and it continues, of course, with the guys from, for example, from the Catalpa expedition. You see this stuff going on, and So this constant influx of politically repressed people, economic migrants from Ireland, keeps people that are maybe a generation or so back, keeps them in touch with their Irish roots, and gives this collective immigrant group a great sense of identity and a cause to root for. So yes, they very much embraced their American experience. They're very proud of their American experience. That's why many people actually signed up to fight in the Civil War, because they felt it was incumbent upon them to defend the Union and preserve the Union. So as proud, newly minted Americans, they did that. And certainly all these immigrants coming in here, the opportunity to vote and have a political say, that was an important, but they didn't lose their connection back to Ireland. And so that provided this funnel that was exploited extraordinarily by the leadership of the leaders of, the post-1916 rising, let's say Michael Collins, and of course Eamon de Valera, who comes over here to basically do sequences of talking tours to raise money. And let's be clear, Eamon de Valera is actually a New Yorker. He's born in New York. His name is not Irish, clearly. I remember sitting in a class at St. John's, and we were reading a book called Babbitt, which is written by Sinclair Lewis. And in that book, there's references made to Eamon de Valera making speeches about Irish independence, and my college professor saying, Babbitt is complaining about this guy raising money. And my college professor said, well, this is an example of how little Babbitt understands about the true world, because clearly there couldn't be somebody called de Valera raising money on behalf of Ireland. And so I kind of waved a hand and said, no.
Actually,
he is the real guy. And it was very funny. There were a couple of students, they're auditing the class, retiree type folks. And they came up to me afterwards and said, thank you for saying that, because we remember de Valera being in New York.
Wow.
But we didn't feel like it was our place to say anything. Said, yes, we remember him well. So this is in the early 1980s. So these are people, if you think about it, maybe some of them were in their 80s. May very well have remembered that experience, which I thought was kind of interesting.
They talk about him here. He visited Albany twice, I think, and Martin Glynn, was governor, and so we knew people who knew the maids in the house, and de Valera would have dinner in the kitchen allegedly because the maids were off the boat, from Ireland, and so. Actually, that's always been really interesting to me, though, how Irish America was so cohesive in one way, particularly after, as you say, like the success kind of them getting involved in the Civil War. They're kind of riding high in several of the cities, particularly on the East Coast, so they're kind of pushing past the anti-Catholic thing. And then de Valera, so I'm letting my own colours show here, but the de Valera 1920 tour is catastrophic really for Irish America, because they end up having this huge fight, the Front of Irish Freedom split, and he sets up his own group. And it looks to me like, particularly then given that Ireland devolves into a civil war itself, that Irish America kind of goes, you know what, like, we'll just concentrate on ourselves. Like, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect for maybe until Kennedy is elected. Like, I always sense that we sort of lose ourselves. Maybe the GI Bill comes out, they're a little bit more successful at being middle class after World War II, so there's less, and Peter Quinn writes about it beautifully in Looking for Jimmy, where we had been kind of like Mick, and you transmogrify into Jimmy, who's a street smart, slick kind of Jimmy Walker, Jimmy Cagney type. But I think there's a kind of a 40-year period there where Irish America is just American.
Well, I'd also say that Ireland didn't exactly endear itself to America during World War II by its,
emergency state,
emergency state, or its neutrality by refusing to be a launch pad, for the retaking of Europe. We can argue the merits of that back and forth. That's just a fact of life. But also Ireland, as a result, was not able to participate or didn't have the benefits of the Marshall Plan.
The Marshall Plan,
So
yeah.
when I refer to the fact that I grew up in a developing nation, to some degree, that was a function of not actually being able to participate in the Marshall Plan, which may have given Ireland a bit of a leg up.
Yeah.
I think that's probably fair commentary. You know, the Civil War certainly blotted our copybook, so to speak. Or and you know, when people become radicalized, and the people that fought for independence were radicalized individuals. And the Civil War is basically a conflict between one crew that would have definitely seen themselves as pragmatists and another crew that would have considered themselves to be authentic revolutionaries.
Yeah.
It's from an outsider point of view, the fact that we see brother turning on brother, cousin upon cousin, it was deeply discomforting. And De Valera certainly drove a wedge in the Irish American community as well by, you know, some of his practices. And he himself kind of, to my understanding, treated himself as somewhat almost like Irish royalty. And I think it took a long time to heal that rift. And I would push back and say that rift really did persist until this Irish policy in the 1980s of really, you know, cranking up soft power. And Ireland then, instead of becoming you know, the De Valera view of Ireland is we're going to become a self-sufficient country. So the country itself, you know, as an independent nation, struggled mightily for its first 50 or 60 years, or actually longer than that, because of a failed experiment of kind of turning inwards and not engaging with the broader community.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about, you know, that colossal error of, you know, we're going to be, you know, the country that got established, in my view, was extraordinarily conservative, Catholic, inward turning, rejecting of modernity.
Yeah.
And when you compare it to the modern day, which is very much different, and I'm not necessarily saying that everything from 50 years ago was all bad. It's not, and nor that everything that is happening now is necessarily all good. But I think if you ask anybody honestly, which country would they prefer to live in, it's pretty much a no-brainer.
Absolutely.
Ireland does have its social problems, but it's nothing on the lines of the poverty, the endemic poverty that the country was steeped in.
And this chokehold that the Catholic Church had on everything, you know, even the difference though between, you know, the 1916 kind of statement and the democratic program, you know, in 1918 when they ran that umbrella election, and then you have De Valera's, you know, Easter speech in, what was it, like the 50s maybe, about comely maidens dancing at the crossroad. Like, my God, you know, those two Irelands were worlds apart, and the progressivism and inclusivity, you know, to cherish all the children of the nation equally, and mentions the diaspora. You know, if we had had that 1918 program in place, I think we would have been a very
De Valera, you know, if you think about it, De Valera was fortunate that he was an American citizen. It's the only reason that he actually survived, chances are. He would have been shot like all the other leaders in 1916. There was a lot of other guys that were well lower on the totem pole that were executed in 1916, and he wasn't. So he was the lucky survivor.
Absolutely, and catapulted him then to the top because there was no other leadership.
Yes, exactly. So it was a space for him, and then of course Civil War, Collins dies, and you know, and Arthur Griffin dies. So you know, it's kind of like the field was cleared for him.
Absolutely, twice.
Very much so, and you know, and he had a very, you know, there's a type, I believe, of Irish Catholicism that was very hierarchical, very kiss the ring, and of course, you know, he was a close friend of Charles McQuaid, who was the Archbishop of Dublin, and those two really kind of drove the country, certainly for 25 years in my view. And, they were kind of like, two horses, hooked up with the same chariot, and everybody else was getting dragged along with it. But it wasn't, economically, it was disastrous. And it's only with the resignation of De Valera and him being kicked up to Arsenal on Uachtaráin as president that you have Sean Lemass, who was his lieutenant during all those years, coming in and saying, okay, we're going to change everything. And you get TJ Whittaker come in and say, okay, we are now going to engage. And so that's the beginning of the new Ireland that we have. It ends essentially with the end of De Valera's status as a political force.
And then to bring America back into it, how important was America, just even as a kind of a silent, big brother standing behind us during the whole Brexit debacle, and what's going on now in terms of whether there will or there won't be a united Ireland. The legacy bill is something, that was passed in Westminster there that will stop all kind of trials into inquiries about, dead civilians, which I think Irish America might be more engaged with than Dublin, and I mean our own government. But I do think America was probably important there. Like, they weren't able to get a trade deal between England and America themselves, and we see, like, every day there's more evidence that England is suffering under Brexit. Whether they choose to admit that that's what it is or not, is a different thing. But so I think the American, just as I say, sort of silent support, not to mention the European support. The EU were very careful to say that, Ireland is a full partner and we're going to back them. But I think that has helped modern Ireland too.
I think so, and certainly Ireland was quite fortunate in the election of Joe Biden. The timing on that was very good in terms of kind of forcing, this Windsor Accord settlement, which is still not entirely baked in. The irony, of course, in talking with various people that are kind of in the know, is that the communities in Northern Ireland, and I would say the loyalist community, the hardcore loyalist community, are deeply invested in the maintenance of their status to their detriment, because ironically their position now is in many respects ideal, because they have the benefit of participating in both the British market and the European community. And so they are the only geographical entity that can exploit that advantage, and it's there for their taking. But they're more consumed in, let's say, certain retrograde members of the loyalist community are more consumed in perpetrating old grievances than understanding that the gift that they have been given, which is extraordinary. Now, I would also add that, again, understanding Ireland and its liberality. So here's an oddity. Ireland is extraordinarily pro-Palestinian, which might surprise many people in America. And Fintan O'Toole had a really good column in the Irish Times recently about the relationship between Ireland and Israel. So, for example, he delves into the fact that many of the guys, the Black and Tan guys that were fighting in the Irish War of Independence, where once the treaty was signed, or ceasefire was take place, they were shipped off over to Palestine to basically do some of the same stuff that they were doing in Ireland. And that when Israel rose up in 1948 against British rule to establish the state of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, the code word he used for his identity during that uprising was Michael. And he was referring to Michael Collins. And the Israelis at that time in 1948 viewed themselves very much in the vein of the Irish Republicans. They were fighting to overthrow British rule, to get independence, etc., etc. Flash forward a few more decades later, and we have the IRA struggling again against, in a very oppressive situation in Northern Ireland. Of course, that manifests itself in violence as well. who is coming to their aid and supporting them. Well, a lot of people in the Palestinian world, certainly in Libya, were supportive of the IRA. Now, we can talk about the reasons behind that, but that has certainly kind of built a bridge between the Palestinian community and the Irish communities that is still persisting to this day.
Yeah.
Modern day Ireland now sees Israel as the occupying force in Palestine, and views the Palestinians very much as the oppressed Irish. So it's a kind of really interesting arc of gnarly, interconnected history and surprising relationships for those that want to look at these kind of things. Nothing is simple. Everything, and in a world that increasingly wants us all to be binary, everything, has shades of meaning and complexities for those that are, intellectually willing to look at these kind of oddities of history and, non-thumbnails interpretation or simplistic interpretations of what's going across the world. So just boomerang back again, Ireland, this is another aspect of its maybe a shift. If you think about in America, Israel bad, Palestinian terrorists, there's a lot of that going on here. That certainly would be very different in Ireland.
Yeah. Oh God, absolutely. And even the coverage, the news coverage, if you were reading the Irish Times as opposed to an American publication, we're probably actually going to discuss that with somebody in December. But I've been trying to tread lightly. Tell me, so Martin, last question before we talk about your podcast. We were going to talk a little bit about the Irish attitude towards the diaspora. First of all, the wider diaspora, this, the grandparent kind of gets you, which is fantastic, this idea of a passport and citizenship. I've actually heard Irish politicians floating the idea, mentioning Israel, about the birthright, thing, and how would we engage with students, maybe a younger generation, to get them to come back. But then on the flip side, you and I, as Irish immigrants that live in America, can't vote in Irish elections. There's talks about allowing us to vote in the presidential election, but of course the Irish president is just a little figurehead, so I don't know if that's worth it to us to vote in those elections. And I'm not altogether sure in one way, where do you cut off the diaspora? Like, I left Ireland in 2005, am I really entitled to vote in an election for a government that won't have anything really to do with me unless, they somehow change pension laws or something, But yeah, so talk a little bit about that the two-pronged approach the Irish government have, because they have a large generational diaspora, but there's huge amounts of immigrants around the world too.
Well, there's 1.6 million people that hold Irish passports that are living overseas. At least that was a study that I had read dating back to 2017. Again, if you compare that to the overall population of Ireland, that is only 6 million. High. So it's an extraordinary number. And so there are fears in Ireland that if all of these people engage, many of whom were not born in Ireland, so we have people that hold passports that have never been to Ireland, maybe hold passports simply because they did it to commemorate a grandparent, etc., would have very little understanding or in-depth understanding of Irish politics, etc. So that's a concern. On the other side of the ledger, you have Irish people that have really, I believe, underappreciate the opportunities in tapping into this extraordinary diaspora experience and how helpful that can be to Ireland. We've already talked at length about how important that was for Ireland's independence. We'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the extraordinary amount of Fortune 500 investment in Ireland that created, what is now called the Celtic Tiger, etc., and the economic boom that has taken place in Ireland. A lot of that has to do, it's not everything, but it has a lot to do with the Irish diaspora. You could also add to that the, let's say, corporate Irish tax rate made things extraordinarily interesting for American companies and provided them all sorts of amusing ways to avoid paying taxes. So again, I think there is maybe a level of ignorance in Ireland as to the importance of the offshore Irish community and what a really vital role it can continue to play in Irish affairs.
Mm-hmm.
The question then becomes is, okay, if we have these 1.6 million people living offshore and all of a sudden they're all going to start to vote, well, they probably won't anyway, but what role should they take, or what election should they be allowed to participate in?
Mm-hmm.
Let's first of all kind of acknowledge that Ireland is peculiar amongst its European brethren in the sense that it doesn't offer offshore voting to its Irish citizens, regardless of how long they have lived offshore. Now, I look at the French model, and they offer something like 10 seats out of 500 odd in the French Parliament. So we are not talking about kind of ceremonial positions like the presidency of Ireland or the Senate in Ireland, just voted around. So I do think that it would behoove the country to provide some political representation within the Dáil, which is the actual, real mechanism that enacts legislation in Ireland. That I think maybe 3 or 4 seats in the Dáil would be entirely appropriate to give that kind of voice and to bind that connection. But also, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that, yes, indeed, all these people living offshore are not paying taxes in Ireland, and therefore maybe shouldn't have quite the same right. So maybe a much smaller representation relative to numbers seems a lot smarter to me. But I think binding that, saying, yes, indeed, I do get to participate in an Irish election. I do get to have my voice heard. And I do have a representative that will speak on my behalf. I think is in the interest of both, the diaspora and the Irish of Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you. We'll just talk. The podcast is called Irish Stew, and it's available where all podcasts are available, on Apple and all these things. But just Google it and it pops up. You have a website.
Absolutely.
And it's filtered through topics there. So like if you're not interested in history and you just want to talk to or hear, you interview somebody famous, you can do that. But they're all beautifully organized. What's the website's name again?
It's called irishstewpodcast.com.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So we'll actually link to it. I'll put a link in on our website when the video of this talk goes up. Martin, thank you so much. Any last thoughts for me?
I think it is an extraordinarily interesting time that we live in, and an interesting time to be Irish in America. I think America and the Western world is at a very interesting point, and we have probably the most Irish of presidents we have had since JFK. Now, I recognize that people that may watch this may have very divergent opinions about Joe Biden, but remember, if you're of Irish extractions, your ancestors valued the opportunity to vote. So please do express your democratic opportunity. Your ancestors, it was extraordinarily important to them. They fought in the Civil War to preserve that. They fought against bigotry to preserve that. And I think it's also really important to remember that the Irish themselves were immigrants at one point in time, and they were treated as the lowest of the low.
Yeah.
And we need to kind of retain our humility. And so I'm reminded of the nativism of the 1840s. I see the same thing playing out right now. And I think as an Irish person in good conscience, I am obliged to speak out against that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very kind of incredible when you see Irish names of politicians attached to various rhetoric, and you're like, oh my God, we were those great unwashed that landed on the shores, as you said, 20% not speaking English, like it is how soon we forget, these stories. Which is why it's so important that we have your podcast and of course our own museum to let people know those stories. So thank you so much on the eve of poor John F. Kennedy's assassination tomorrow. I'm glad we were talking about him a little bit. And of course, Thanksgiving is coming up. So thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving. We'll be back next Monday night on Zoom. I forget what time, with a talk about the Irish and the Native Americans to continue our series, The Irish and the following night at 5:30 Tuesday, we'll be on with a doctor from Ireland who's going to talk to us about the history of the lunatic asylum, which Grange Gorman was the largest lunatic asylum, and he's used that word in the 19th century. We had more inmates in Ireland in lunatic asylums than they did in Europe. So that's setting us up nicely for Christmas. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great night. And Martin, I'll be in touch with you.
Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.